When the church doors exploded open, 300 guests turned to stare, and the bride realized her nightmare wasn't ending, it was just beginning. She stood at the altar in a dress that cost more than her yearly rent, about to marry the man who once broke 3 of her ribs. The judge, his father, had made sure she had no choice. But when a stranger walked down that aisle with the kind of quiet that makes powerful men nervous, everything she thought she knew about power, protection, and freedom shattered like glass under a boot. Stay until the end to see how one word at the altar brought down an empire. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Charleston summer pressed against the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Cathedral like something alive and hungry. Inside, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against 300 bodies packed into mahogany pews, their designer clothes and expensive perfumes creating a fog of wealth so thick you could choke on it. Alara Vance stood at the altar and tried to remember how to breathe. The dress was perfect. Vera Wang, custom fitted with seed pearls that caught the light every time her chest rose and fell. The florist had woven white roses and peonies through every available surface until the whole cathedral smelled like a funeral home. The quartet in the corner played something classical and forgettable. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except for the groom. Damien Crowe stood across from her in a Tom Ford tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's cars, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass. His dark hair swept back in that effortlessly perfect way that made strangers on the street turn and stare. He looked like old money, and New Ambition had a baby and named it Success. The kind of man mothers pointed out to their daughters. The kind of man who smiled for cameras and shook hands with senators. The kind of man who had once held her head underwater in a bathtub until her vision went black at the edges. His hand wrapped around hers now, warm and firm, and she felt her body lock up like a door slamming shut. He noticed, he always noticed, and his thumb traced a small circle against her palm. To anyone watching, it would look tender, intimate. She knew it was a warning. "You look beautiful," he murmured, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did when they were alone. When they were in front of people, he could make that smile travel all the way to his soul. That was the talent that made him dangerous. The officiant, some ancient minister his father had probably golfed with, cleared his throat and began the ceremony. His voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling, turning the words into something that sounded more like a sentencing than a celebration. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Alara's gaze drifted past Damien's shoulder to the front row, where Judge Alistair Crowe sat like a king surveying his kingdom. 73 years old and still commanded a room like gravity itself bent to his will. Silver hair, steel eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who believed in harsh truths and harsher punishments. He caught her looking and his expression didn't change. Didn't need to. She knew what that face meant. She'd seen it 3 weeks ago, when he'd walked into the coffee shop where she'd been working, sat down across from her small table, and laid out exactly what was going to happen to her life. "You're going to marry my son," he'd said, not asked. His voice had been quiet, almost gentle, the kind of quiet that made you listen harder because you knew what came next would hurt. "You're going to smile and say yes and walk down that aisle like it's the happiest day of your life." She'd tried to say no, tried to stand up, to walk away, to do anything except sit there and let this man demolish the small, quiet life she'd spent 2 years building from nothing. Then he'd slid the folder across the table. Inside were photographs, financial records, police reports that didn't exist yet, but would the moment he made a phone call, all of it pointing to her, all of it fabricated, all of it enough to put her in prison for the next decade. And underneath those, a single photograph that made her blood turn to ice. Mrs. Chen, 78 years old, barely spoke English, lived in the apartment next to Alara's, and made dumplings every Sunday morning that she insisted on sharing. The woman had survived things Alara couldn't imagine and crossed an ocean to build a life where she felt safe. In the photograph, she was getting into a car outside the immigration office downtown. "She's here illegally," the judge had said, watching Alara's face. "Has been for 15 years. One phone call and she's on a plane back to a country that will kill her for what she left behind." Alara had stared at that photograph until her vision blurred. "Why?" she'd whispered. The judge had leaned back, folded his hands. Because my son wants you, and what my son wants, he gets. He beat me. He was young, troubled. He's changed. He broke my arm, 3 ribs. He put me in the hospital. You never pressed charges. Because she'd been terrified. Because Damien had stood over her hospital bed and promised that if she said a word to anyone, he'd make sure she disappeared in a way that meant her body would never be found. Because she'd been 23 and alone and so scared she could barely think straight. But she couldn't say that to his father. Not when the man was looking at her like she was a problem to be solved, not a person to be heard. Press charges now, the judge had said, reading her mind, and we'll destroy you in court. Every text message you ever sent him, every voicemail, we'll paint you as an obsessive ex-girlfriend who can't let go. We'll dig into every mistake you've ever made and broadcast it to the world. He'd paused. And then we'll make sure Mrs. Chen spends her final years somewhere very far from here. Alara had sat there, feeling the walls close in. So here's what's going to happen, the judge had continued. You're going to accept Damien's proposal. You're going to plan a beautiful wedding. You're going to stand up in front of Charleston society and pledge yourself to him. His smile had been colder than his words. And if you run, if you fight, if you breathe wrong, I'll bury you so deep they'll need a map to find your grave. She'd wanted to flip the table, to scream, to do something, anything that proved she still had control over her own life. Instead, she'd nodded, because she'd already been buried once, and clawing her way out had nearly killed her. Now she stood at the altar in a dress that weighed more than her dignity, and tried to remember what freedom had felt like. The officiant droned on. Behind her, she could hear someone crying, probably Damien's mother, who'd spent the entire rehearsal dinner dabbing at her eyes and talking about grandchildren. The woman had looked at Alara like she was a broodmare being appraised for breeding quality. If anyone present knows of any reason why this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony, the officiant said, his voice gaining strength like he was finally getting to the good part. Speak now or forever. Hold your peace. Silence. Always silence at this part. Nobody ever actually... The cathedral doors exploded open. Not literally, but the sound of them hitting the interior walls was so loud it might as well have been an explosion. 300 heads turned in perfect unison, a wave of shock rolling through the pews like someone had thrown a stone into still water. A man stood in the doorway. Alara's first thought was that he looked wrong for a wedding. Dark suit, yes, but not formal. No tie. His hair was black and slightly too long, brushing his collar. He stood there like he owned the building, like he'd bought it that morning and was considering whether to demolish it or renovate. The afternoon sun streamed through the open doors behind him, turning him into a silhouette. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing. He started walking, not rushing, not hesitating, just walking down the center aisle with the kind of certainty that made you believe he'd calculated every step before he took it. "Excuse me," the officiant sputtered, finding his voice. "Sir, this is a private..." The man didn't look at him. His eyes were locked on the altar, on Damien. No, on her. Alara felt her pulse kick into something that wasn't quite panic, but wasn't calm either. She'd never seen this man before. Had she? There was something about the way he moved, the way he held himself, that felt almost familiar. Damien's hand tightened on hers, not the warning squeeze from before. This was different. This was anger wrapped in surprise, wrapped in something that might have been fear. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered. The man reached the front of the cathedral and stopped. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 35 with the kind of face that didn't give anything away. Dark eyes that looked like they'd seen things and filed them away for later use. A mouth that suggested he didn't smile often, but when he did, it probably meant someone was about to have a very bad day. He looked at Damien first, just looked, said nothing. Damien's face went red. "You need to leave. Now!" The man's gaze shifted to Alara, and for a second, just a second, she saw something in his expression that looked almost like recognition, like he knew her, like he'd been looking for her. Then he turned to phase the congregation, 300 people who'd probably never been interrupted at anything in their entire privileged lives. When he spoke, his voice carried without shouting. The kind of voice that made you listen because it didn't demand attention. It assumed you were already paying. She's not marrying you today. The silence that followed was so complete, Alara could hear her own heartbeat. Damien laughed. It was the sound he made when he was about to hurt someone and wanted them to know he was going to enjoy it. Security! Two men in suits started moving from their positions near the doors. They were big, the kind of big that suggested they'd been hired for exactly this type of situation. The stranger didn't even glance at them. I wouldn't, he said quietly. Something in his tone made them stop. Judge Crow stood up in the front pew. Young man, I don't know who you are, but Lucian Moretti. The name dropped into the room like a bomb with the pin still in, but the pin was sweating. Alara saw the judge's face change, saw recognition flash across it, followed by something that looked a lot like calculation. You have no business here, the judge said, his voice still controlled but not quite as steady. Lucien, if that was really his name, smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. I think we have different definitions of business. He reached into his jacket, and Alara saw Damien flinch beside her. For a second, she thought he was reaching for a weapon, thought this beautiful disaster of a wedding was about to become a crime scene. But he pulled out a phone. Just a phone. He tapped the screen once, then held it up so the nearest guest could see. This, he said, still in that quiet, carrying voice, is a live feed that just went out to every major news outlet in the state. Federal authorities, social media, you name it. On the screen, Alara could see it from where she stood, was a document. Legal, official looking, the kind of thing that had seals and signatures and the weight of institutions behind it. What you're looking at, Lucien continued, is a comprehensive report on the Crow family's involvement in human trafficking, fraud, bribery, and abuse of power spanning the last 3 decades. The room exploded. Not physically, but the sound that rose from 300 people simultaneously trying to process what they'd just heard was like a wall of noise that made Alara's ears ring. Damien lunged. He moved fast. He'd always been fast, that had been part of the problem, but Lucien was faster. He sidestepped and Damien crashed into the space where he'd been standing, stumbling, catching himself on the altar rail. You son of a... Your father, Lucien said, cutting him off, has been using his position as a federal judge to protect a network that traffics women across state lines. You've been personally involved in at least 6 cases of domestic violence that were buried through falsified records and intimidated witnesses. He turned back to the crowd, to the phones that were now coming out of pockets and purses, to the cameras that were starting to record. 3 months ago, Alara Vance tried to rebuild her life after escaping an abusive relationship with Damien Crow. She changed her name, moved cities, found work. She did everything right. His voice didn't rise, but somehow it got harder, colder. 2 weeks ago, Judge Alistair Crow tracked her down and threatened her with fabricated criminal charges and deportation of an innocent woman if she didn't agree to marry his son. He used his position, his power, and his complete lack of humanity to force a woman into a marriage she doesn't want with a man who put her in the hospital. Alara couldn't breathe. Everyone was staring at her now. She could feel it. 300 pairs of eyes, all suddenly seeing her not as a bride, but as a victim, as a story, as entertainment. That's a lie, Damien's voice cracked. We're in love, tell them. He grabbed her wrist, and she felt her body go rigid, that old familiar fear flooding through her like ice water in her veins. Tell them, he shouted, and his fingers dug into her skin hard enough to bruise. For 2 years, she'd been silent. For 2 years, she'd swallowed every truth that might have set her free because the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of hiding. She looked at Damien's face, red with rage, twisted with desperation, and something inside her that had been locked down tight just let go. No, she said. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but in that cathedral, in that moment, it sounded like thunder. Damien's grip tightened. What did you say? I said no. Louder now, stronger. I don't love you. I never loved you. You're a monster and your father is worse, and I would rather die than marry you. His hand came up and she knew what was coming. She'd seen that movement before, felt the impact that followed. Lucien caught his wrist mid-swing. Damien tried to pull away, but Lucien held him there, effortless, like he was restraining a child throwing a tantrum. Don't, Lucien said quietly. Not here. Not now. Not ever again. The security guards were moving again, but this time they weren't heading for Lucien. They were heading for the judge, who was on his phone, who was trying to make calls that Alara suspected weren't going through. The evidence is already with the FBI, Lucien said, releasing Damien with a small push that sent him stumbling backward. The State Attorney General, Internal Affairs, every oversight committee that might have turned a blind eye before is looking at this now. In about, he checked his watch. 3 minutes. Federal agents are going to walk through those doors with warrants. The judge's face had gone pale. Not white. Men like him didn't go white, but pale in a way that suggested his body was redirecting blood to vital organs because it knew a crisis when it felt one. "You're bluffing," he said. Lucien raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" Sirens. Distant at first, then closer. Multiple vehicles. The kind of convoy that showed up when the charges were serious and the defendants were flight risks. The guests started moving. Not running, people like this didn't run, but there was a definite shift toward the exits, toward distance, toward plausible deniability. Nobody wanted to be photographed at a wedding that was about to become a federal case. Damien was breathing hard, staring at Alara like she'd betrayed him, like she was the villain in this story. "You can't do this," he said. "You can't just... We had an agreement, a plan. You said..." "I said yes because your father threatened to destroy an innocent woman's life," Alara said, and her voice was shaking, but she was still standing, still talking. "I said yes because he fabricated evidence. I said yes because I was scared and alone, and I didn't see another way out." She looked at Lucien, at this stranger who'd walked into her nightmare and somehow turned it inside out. "Who are you?" she asked. "Someone who doesn't like bullies," he said. The cathedral doors opened again. This time it was men in FBI windbreakers, federal agents with badges and weapons, and the kind of authority that even Judge Crow couldn't talk his way around. They moved through the pews with practiced efficiency, heading straight for the altar. "Alistair Crow," the lead agent said, "you're under arrest for..." The judge tried to run. He actually tried to run. A 73-year-old man in a three-piece suit tried to sprint down the side aisle like he was going to outrun federal agents 30 years younger than him. They had him on the ground in seconds. Damien watched his father get handcuffed and dragged to his feet, watched the man who'd controlled his entire life suddenly look small and old and human. Then he turned back to Alara. "This isn't over," he said. Lucien stepped between them. "Yeah," he said softly. "It is." More agents were flooding in now. Reading rights, securing evidence, ushering guests toward the exits where squad cars were probably waiting to take statements. Alara stood at the altar in her perfect dress, surrounded by chaos, and felt something strange bloom in her chest. Freedom. It felt like terror and relief, and about 100 other things she didn't have names for yet. An agent approached her, a woman with kind eyes and a badge that said she'd seen worse than this. "Ms. Vance, we're going to need you to come with us. We have some questions, and we'll need your statement for the formal charges." Alara nodded. Couldn't quite speak yet. The woman's expression softened. "You're not in trouble. You're a witness, and if what we've seen is accurate, you're also a victim. We're going to make sure you're protected." Protected. When was the last time she'd felt protected? She glanced at Lucien, who was talking to another agent, gesturing at his phone, explaining something in that calm, measured way that suggested he'd planned every second of this down to the timing of the sirens. "Who is he?" she asked the agent. The woman followed her gaze. "Moretti, private security consultant, former federal prosecutor, has a reputation for taking cases nobody else wants to touch." She paused. "Word is he doesn't take cases for money anymore, just picks the ones that piss him off." "Why would he..." Alara started, then stopped, because she remembered now, 3 months ago. The coffee shop where she'd been working. A man who came in twice a week, ordered black coffee, never made small talk. Tipped well, but not excessively. Polite. Forgettable. Except he'd noticed. When her hand shook on a particularly bad day, when she flinched at loud noises, when she checked the door every time someone walked in. He'd noticed, and he'd said nothing. Until now. "He was watching me," she said. "He was watching them," the agent corrected gently. "The Crows have been on his radar for a while. You just gave him the opening he needed to bring them down. Alara wasn't sure how she felt about that. Being an opening, being a tool someone used, even if the cause was righteous. But then she looked at Damien, being led away in handcuffs, still shouting about lawyers and mistakes and how this was all going to blow over. She looked at the judge, silent now, defeated in a way he'd probably never been before. And she thought maybe, just this once, being a tool was fine, if the alternative was being a victim. Lucian finished with the agents and walked over. Up close, she could see the details she'd missed before. The small scar above his left eyebrow. The way his eyes were different colors if you looked carefully. One dark brown, one just a shade lighter. The calluses on his hands that suggested he didn't just talk about violence, he knew how to deliver it. "Thank you," she said. "Because what else do you say to someone who just detonated your life in the best possible way?" "Don't thank me yet," he said. "This is going to get messy. They'll fight. They'll try to discredit you. They'll make you relive everything you've been trying to forget." "I know. You'll need protection, legal representation, somewhere safe to stay while this plays out. I can't afford—" "Already handled." He said it like it was nothing, like arranging someone's entire life was just something he did on weekdays. "You won't pay for any of it. Lawyers are pro bono. Safe house is owned by a friend. You just have to show up and tell the truth." Alara stared at him. "Why are you doing this?" For the first time, something that might have been emotion crossed his face. "Because men like Alistair Crowe think they own the world, and someone needs to remind them they're wrong." He turned to leave, then paused. "That neighbor of yours, Mrs. Chen, she's fine. Her immigration status was never in question. The judge fabricated everything. She's a legal permanent resident, has been for 12 years. The relief that crashed through Alara was so strong it made her knees weak. "How did you—" "I checked everything, every threat he made, every piece of evidence he claimed to have. It was all smoke." His jaw tightened. But that's what men like him do. They make you believe you're powerless when you never were." He walked away before she could respond, disappearing into the controlled chaos of the federal investigation. The agent was still waiting, patient but expectant. "Ready?" she asked. Alara looked down at her dress, at the ring on her finger that felt like a shackle. She pulled it off and let it drop. It hit the marble floor with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. "Yeah," she said. "I'm ready." Unten. Outside the cathedral, Charleston's summer heat hit her like a wall. The sky was too blue, the sun too bright. Everything felt surreal. News vans were already pulling up, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. The agent guided her toward an unmarked car, shielding her from the worst of it. As they pulled away from St. Michael's, Alara looked back one last time. The cathedral still stood, beautiful and untouched. The flowers would be thrown away. The cake would be donated. The guests would go home and tell stories about the craziest wedding they'd ever attended. And Alara Vance, who'd walked in as a bride and walked out as a witness, would begin the hard work of figuring out who she was when she wasn't busy surviving. The agent's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and smiled. "What?" Alara asked. "They're already finding more. The investigation is spreading. Apparently the Crows were connected to a trafficking network that spans 6 states. She looked at Alara with something that might have been admiration. "You just helped bring down one of the largest criminal operations in the Southeast." Alara didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd been drowning and finally broke the surface. Breathing hurt, but at least she was breathing. The city rolled past the windows, familiar streets she'd walked 1,000 times, landmarks she'd memorized. It all looked the same, but felt different. Freedom, she was learning, didn't announce itself with trumpets. It whispered. And sometimes it walked through cathedral doors in a dark suit and burned your whole world down so you could build a new one. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it. The fear, the relief, the uncertainty. All of it. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't push it down or lock it away. She just felt it and kept breathing. That, she thought, was a start. The safe house wasn't what she expected. Alara had pictured something institutional. Sterile rooms, fluorescent lights, the kind of place where broken people went to be processed and filed away. Instead, the agent pulled up to a renovated townhouse in a quiet neighborhood where trees lined the sidewalks and kids rode bikes in circles. "This is it?" Alara asked. Agent Morrison, she'd finally introduced herself properly during the drive, nodded. Third floor. The whole building is owned by a private security firm. They use it for witness protection overflow and high-risk cases. You'll have your own apartment, full kitchen, no roommates unless you want them. I don't. Morrison smiled like she'd expected that answer. Door locks from the inside, security cameras on every entrance. If you need anything, there's a number by the phone. Someone's always available. She handed Alara a key and a folder thick with documents. What's this? Your new life, temporarily. Bank account with enough to get you through the next few months. New phone. Your old number's been disconnected. Contact information for your legal team. They'll want to meet with you tomorrow to start building the case. Morrison paused. And a restraining order that went into effect about an hour ago. Damien, his father, anyone associated with them comes within 500 feet of you. They go straight back to jail. Alara took the folder with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. How long do I have to stay here? Until the trial. Could be 6 months. Could be a year. Depends on how much they fight and how deep the investigation goes. Morrison's expression softened. I know it's not ideal, but it's safe, and right now, that's what matters. Safe. That word kept showing up like it meant something simple. Alara climbed out of the car and stood on the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the afternoon pressing down on her shoulders. She was still wearing the wedding dress, still had baby's breath tangled in her hair. She looked like she'd escaped from a cake topper. You need anything else tonight? Morrison asked through the open window. No, Alara stopped, reconsidered. Actually, yes. Do you know where Lucien Moretti is? Morrison's expression flickered with something that might have been approval. Probably giving statements downtown. Why? I need to talk to him. He'll come by, probably tomorrow. He's technically your security consultant for the duration of this mess. Morrison put the car in drive. Get some rest. You've had a hell of a day. She drove off before Alara could ask what security consultant actually meant. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, just like Morrison said. Clean, furnished. Someone had stocked the fridge with basics. Milk, eggs, bread. Enough to survive on until she could think straight. Alara locked the door behind her and stood in the middle of the living room, still in her wedding dress, and tried to figure out what to do next. Her phone buzzed. The new one. The number nobody had except Morrison. She pulled it out. Unknown caller. Her finger hovered over the decline button. Then something made her answer. Hello? It's me. She didn't recognize the voice at first. Then her brain caught up. Mrs. Chen? Alara, oh, thank goodness. The nice FBI lady gave me this number. She said you were okay, but I needed to hear for myself. The old woman's accent was thick, her English broken but determined. They came to my apartment, asked questions. I was so scared. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to... No, don't apologize. They told me everything. That terrible man, he lied to you. About me, about everything. Mrs. Chen's voice cracked. You were going to marry that monster to protect me. Alara's throat tightened. He said he'd have you deported. I've been legal for 12 years. I have my green card. I showed them. They said it was all fake, all lies he made up. There was a pause. Then Mrs. Chen said something in Mandarin that sounded like cursing. He used me to hurt you. If I ever see him, I will... You won't see him. He's in jail. Good. He should rot there. Another pause. Are you safe? Where are you? Somewhere safe. I can't really say where yet. Okay, that's good. Mrs. Chen sniffled. You come see me when this is over, yes? I'll make dumplings, the good ones, with the pork and the chives. Alara smiled despite everything. I'd like that. After they hung up, Alara stood there holding the phone and feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Relief, maybe. Or the absence of guilt. She'd spent 3 weeks believing she was responsible for Mrs. Chen's safety, that one wrong move would destroy an innocent woman's life. And it had all been fiction, a story designed to control her. She looked down at the wedding dress, at the seed pearls, and the perfect stitching, and the way it was already starting to feel like a costume from someone else's play. She wanted it off, wanted it gone. The bathroom had a pair of scissors in the medicine cabinet, the good kind, sharp and professional. She stood in front of the mirror and started cutting. The fabric resisted at first, then gave way. Pearls scattered across the tile floor like hail, lace tore, silk shredded. She cut until her arms hurt, and the dress was nothing but ribbons and rags piled around her feet. When she was done, she stood there in her underwear, surrounded by destruction, and felt lighter than she had in months. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from a number she didn't recognize. "It's Lucy Yan. Morrison gave me your new number. Are you okay?" She stared at the message, trying to decide how to answer. Was she okay? She'd been forced into a wedding, watched her abuser get arrested, learned her entire nightmare had been built on lies, and just destroyed a $15,000 dress with craft scissors. "Define okay," she typed back. The response came fast. "Fair point. Did you eat?" She looked at the fridge, at the supplies someone had thoughtfully stocked, at the idea of cooking something when her hands were still shaking. "Not yet." "I'll bring food." 30 minutes. She should have said no. Should have told him she needed space, needed time, needed to process everything without a stranger showing up at her door. But she was hungry and alone, and the idea of spending the rest of the night in silence felt worse than company. "Okay," she sent. Then she went to find something to wear that wasn't made of wedding dress. Lucien showed up exactly 30 minutes later with Thai food and a backpack that looked like it had seen better days. He changed out of the suit into jeans and a dark Henley that made him look less like someone who'd just dismantled a criminal empire and more like someone who fixed motorcycles in his spare time. "You cut up the dress," he said, noticing the scraps still scattered across the bathroom floor. "Seemed appropriate." "Fair." He set the food on the kitchen counter. "Pad Thai and spring rolls. I didn't know what you liked, so I guessed." "This is fine. Good, actually." She pulled plates from the cabinet, trying not to think about how surreal this was. "You didn't have to bring food. You didn't eat at the wedding." She stopped. "How do you know that?" "Because you were too busy trying not to throw up." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather. Adrenaline and fear do that. Makes eating impossible. Alara dished out food in silence, processing the fact that this man had apparently been watching her carefully enough to notice things like that. They ate at the small dining table by the window. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into evening, porch lights coming on, families calling kids inside. The ordinary rhythm of lives that didn't involve federal investigations. "How long were you following me?" she asked, finally. Lucien looked up from his plate. 3 months, give or take." "That's creepy." "Yeah." He didn't apologize. "But it's also how I got enough evidence to burn their entire operation to the ground. You could have warned me, could have told me what you were planning." "Could have. But if the judge suspected you knew anything, he would have changed tactics, maybe done something worse. I needed him to feel confident, needed him to make his move in a way I could document and weaponize." Alara set down her fork. "So I was bait. You were going to marry your abuser to protect someone who didn't need protecting. I gave you a way out." His expression didn't change. "If you want to be angry about the method, be angry. But the result is that you're here and they're in federal custody." She wanted to be angry, wanted to feel violated, used, manipulated, but mostly she just felt tired. "Why?" she asked. "Why go through all this trouble for someone you don't know?" Lucien was quiet for a moment, pushing food around his plate. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower. "I had a sister, Emma. She married young to a guy who seemed perfect on paper. Lawyer, came from a good family, all the right credentials." Had. Past tense. Alara's chest tightened. "He broke her jaw on their honeymoon. Put her in the hospital twice in the first year. She tried to leave and he convinced her it was her fault. That she was imagining things, that nobody would believe her." Lucien's jaw worked. She finally got the courage to file for divorce and press charges. His family, wealthy, connected, exactly like the Crows, buried everything, made her look unstable, destroyed her credibility. What happened? "She killed herself 2 days before the trial." He said it flat, clinical, like emotion was something he'd locked away in a box and thrown the key into deep water. Left a note apologizing for not being strong enough to fight them. Alara's throat closed up. "I was in law school at the time. Thought I was going to be this crusading prosecutor, putting bad guys away, making the system work." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Instead, I learned that the system protects people with money and power. Always has. Probably always will. So you quit? I graduated, became a federal prosecutor, spent 5 years working inside the system trying to change it. He met her eyes. Then I realized I could do more damage from the outside. Started taking cases nobody else wanted. The ones where the victim had no money, no connections, no hope. The ones where the abuser had everything. And you just, what? Destroy them? I document everything, build cases that are airtight. Then I hand them to people who can actually make arrests stick. He leaned back. Sometimes that means following people for months, invading their privacy, becoming part of their lives without permission. That's still creepy. Yeah, but it works. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, someone was playing music, something with a lot of bass that made the windows vibrate. I'm sorry, Ilara said finally, about your sister. Don't be sorry, be alive. He stood, started clearing plates. She didn't get that choice. You do. Ilara watched him move around her temporary kitchen like he belonged there. What happens now? Now you give your statement, meet with lawyers, they'll prep you for testimony. It's going to be invasive and exhausting, and you're going to have to relive every bad thing that happened. He paused at the sink. But they'll also have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the Crows did everything I said they did, and I made sure the evidence is bulletproof. What if they have better lawyers? They do, but lawyers can't argue with bank records, wire transfers, testimony from victims who are finally willing to talk, and video footage of the judge threatening you. He turned. I recorded everything, the conversation at the coffee shop, every phone call he made setting up the wedding, all of it. She should have been relieved. Instead, she felt something closer to vertigo. How did you record the coffee shop conversation? You were wearing a necklace, small gold pendant. Her hand went to her throat. The necklace was gone now. She'd taken it off along with everything else from the wedding. I gave you that necklace, Lucian said, 2 months ago. Left it at your workstation with a note that said it was from a grateful customer. You wore it every day. Ilara stared at him. You bugged me. I gave you evidence. There's a difference. Is there? One gets you justice, the other is just invasive. He said it like the distinction was obvious. Ilara stood up, paced to the window, came back. You're saying you've been recording everything I've said for 2 months? Not everything, just situations where you were interacting with the Crows or people connected to them. I didn't listen to your personal calls or conversations with friends. I'm not a monster. You're something. Yeah, I'm the guy who just saved your life. He said it without arrogance, just fact. You can hate the method, but tomorrow when you sit down with federal prosecutors and they play recordings of the judge threatening to destroy you, you'll be glad I was willing to cross lines. He was right, and she hated that he was right. I need you to leave, she said. Lucian nodded, grabbed his backpack. I'll be back tomorrow. 9 a.m. We'll go to the federal building together. I can get there myself. You could, but Damien made bail 2 hours ago. The room tilted. What? His lawyers are good. Argued he wasn't a flight risk. Judge, different judge, not his father, agreed. He's out on a $2 million bond with an ankle monitor and orders to stay away from you. Lucien's expression hardened. But orders are just words, so I'll be here at 9 to make sure those words matter. He left before she could argue. Ilara locked the door behind him, checked it twice, then went to every window and made sure they were secured. The apartment suddenly felt less safe, less isolated. She pulled out her phone and found the number Morrison had given her, the one for emergencies. Then she put it down. What was she going to say? That she was scared? That the idea of Damien being out there, free to move around, made her want to crawl under the bed and stay there? They already knew that. That's why they'd given her the panic button disguised as a phone. She took a shower instead. Hot enough to hurt. Long enough that the water ran cold. When she got out, she checked all the locks again. Then she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to convince herself that tomorrow would be easier than today. It wasn't. Lucien showed up at 8:50, which meant he'd probably been outside for 20 minutes, making sure nobody was watching the building. He had coffee and bagels and the kind of alert readiness that suggested he hadn't slept much. You look tired, she said. So do you. They drove to the federal building in silence. Downtown Charleston was already awake. Tourists flooding the streets, horse-drawn carriages clopping past, the whole city performing its usual dance of Southern charm and hidden history. The federal building was all concrete and glass and security checkpoints. Morrison met them in the lobby with two other agents and a woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Sarah Chen, lead prosecutor on the case. "No relation," she said when Alara's eyes widened at the name. "But I've been briefed on the situation with your neighbor. That was particularly cruel." They walked through more security, down hallways that smelled like burned coffee and institutional cleaning products, into a conference room with a table long enough to seat 20 people. Only 6 chairs were occupied. Sarah sat at the head. Morrison and the other agents flanked her. Lucian took a seat in the corner, far enough to give Alara space, but close enough that she could see him if she needed to. "Let's start with the basics," Sarah said, pulling out a laptop. "I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning. How you met Damien, what the relationship was like, when it turned violent, why you left, and how his father found you." Alara's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table. "Take your time," Morrison said gently. "We have all day." So she talked. Started with the beginning, meeting Damien at a gallery opening when she was 22, and stupid enough to believe that charm meant kindness. How he'd pursued her with flowers and expensive dinners, and all the attention she'd been starved for her whole life. How he'd made her feel seen, then how he'd made her feel small. The first time he'd grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise, he'd apologized for 3 days straight, sent roses, cried, promised it would never happen again. It happened again 2 weeks later. "He had rules," Alara said, staring at her hands. "About what I wore, who I talked to, where I went. At first I thought it was just, I don't know, concern. Like he cared so much he worried." She laughed, bitter. "Turns out concern and control look the same from certain angles." Sarah was typing, recording everything. "When did it escalate to physical violence?" 6 months in. We were at his apartment. I wanted to go home because I had work in the morning. He said I was being difficult, that if I really loved him, I'd stay." Alara's voice flattened. "I tried to leave anyway. He grabbed my wrist, twisted it until I heard something crack. Then he acted like I'd done it to myself, like I was clumsy." "Did you get medical attention?" "He took me to the hospital, told the doctors I'd fallen. I was too scared to say anything different." The questions kept coming, detailed, specific, painful. Sarah wanted dates, times, witnesses. She wanted to know about every injury, every threat, every moment when Alara had wanted to run but couldn't. 3 hours in, they took a break. Alara went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face. When she looked up, Lucian was leaning against the wall outside. "You're doing good," he said. "I feel like I'm being autopsied." "You are. But it's necessary. Every detail makes the case stronger." She dried her hands on rough paper towels. "How much longer?" "Couple more hours, then they'll want to go through the judge's threats. After that, we're done for today." "What about tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we start on the trafficking network. But that's not about you. That's about the other victims." Alara looked at him. "How many others?" 43 that we've identified so far. Could be more." His expression went dark. "The Crows have been running this operation for decades. Your situation with Damien, that was personal. But the larger network, that's business." She felt sick. "Come on," Lucien said. "Let's get you some real coffee before round 2. They found a break room with a coffee pot that looked like it predated the building. Lucien poured 2 cups of something that resembled coffee if you squinted. "This is terrible," Alara said after one sip. "Yeah, but it's caffeinated." He leaned against the counter. "You holding up okay?" "Define okay?" He almost smiled. "You keep saying that." "Because nobody's defined it yet." They stood there in silence, drinking bad coffee, while the building hummed around them. "After this is over," Alara said quietly, "what happens to me? What do you want to happen? I don't know. I've spent so long just trying to survive that I don't remember what it's like to actually live." Lucien set down his cup. "Then you figure it out. You have time now. Use it." "Is that what you did? After your sister?" "No, I spent 10 years being angry and turning that anger into something productive. Probably not the healthiest coping mechanism. He paused. But it worked for me. You'll find what works for you. Morrison appeared in the doorway. Ready for round two? Alara drained her coffee, grimaced at the taste, and nodded. Back in the conference room, Sarah had pulled up files on her laptop. Crime scene photos, hospital records, bank statements showing payments made to keep victims quiet. I'm going to show you some images, Sarah said. They're going to be difficult. If you need to stop at any time, just say so. The first photo was of a woman Alara didn't recognize. Bruised, broken, eyes that stared at the camera like they'd given up on believing in help. Her name was Rachel Torres. She pressed charges against Damien 4 years ago. The case disappeared. We found her last week working at a diner in Atlanta under a different name. Sarah's voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. She's agreed to testify. More photos, more women, more stories that sounded horrifyingly similar to Alara's own. By the time they finished, Alara felt hollowed out. We have enough, Sarah said, closing her laptop. More than enough. The judge used his position to bury cases, intimidate witnesses, and facilitate his son's violence. The trafficking network ran parallel to that, using the same tactics, the same corruption, the same belief that money and power put them above the law. When's the trial? Alara asked. 6 months, if we're lucky. Could be longer if they file delays, but we're going to push for fast track given the severity and the number of victims. Sarah met her eyes. You're going to have to testify. Stand in front of a courtroom and tell your story again. Defense attorneys will try to destroy your credibility. It's going to be brutal. I know. But you won't be alone. We have 43 other women willing to stand up with you. We have evidence that can't be explained away. And we have Lucien's recordings that prove coercion and corruption at the highest level. Alara glanced at Lucien, still sitting in his corner, watching everything with those dark, unreadable eyes. What happens if they win? She asked. Sarah's expression hardened. They won't. I don't lose cases like this. It should have been reassuring. Instead, Alara just felt the weight of 6 more months stretching out in front of her like a prison sentence she hadn't earned. The nightmare started on day 4. Alara would wake up gasping, sheets twisted around her legs, the phantom sensation of hands on her throat still so real she had to turn on every light in the apartment to convince herself she was alone. The safe house felt less safe in the dark. Every creak of the building settling sounded like footsteps. Every car engine outside could have been Damien circling the block, ankle monitor be damned. On day 7, she stopped sleeping entirely. Lucien noticed. He showed up at her door at 6 in the morning with coffee and the kind of observational skills that made her want to throw things at him. You look like hell, he said, pushing past her into the apartment. Good morning to you too. He set the coffee on the counter and turned to face her with his arms crossed. When's the last time you slept? I sleep. When's the last time you slept for more than 2 hours? She didn't answer. Couldn't, really, because she'd lost track somewhere around day 5. Lucien's jaw tightened. The trial's 6 months away. You can't sustain this. I'm fine. You're not. And lying about it doesn't help. He pulled out his phone, typed something, put it away. Dr. Reeves will be here at 2. Who's Dr. Reeves? Therapist, specializes in trauma. Works with the victims in cases like this. He said it like it was already decided. You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to, but you need to talk to someone who isn't me or the prosecutors. Alara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need therapy, didn't need someone poking around in her head, didn't need anything except for this whole nightmare to be over. But she was so tired. Fine, she said. Dr. Reeves turned out to be a woman in her 50s with gray hair she didn't bother to dye and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She showed up with a worn leather bag and the kind of calm that suggested she'd seen worse than whatever Alara was carrying. I'm not going to ask how you're doing, she said, settling into the armchair across from Alara. That's a useless question, and you'd lie anyway. Alara blinked. Excuse me? Everyone lies when therapists ask how they're doing. It's reflex, so let's skip that part. Dr. Reeves pulled out a notebook. Instead, tell me what you're not sleeping about. What makes you think I'm not sleeping? Lucien called me. Also, your hands are shaking and you've got the kind of dark circles that suggest your body's running on fumes. She pushed her glasses up. So, the nightmares. What are they about? Alara stared at this woman who'd walked into her temporary life and immediately started dismantling her defenses. Does it matter? It might. Depends on whether you want to keep having them or figure out how to make them stop. You can't make trauma stop. No, but you can learn to carry it differently. Dr. Reeves clicked her pen. Right now you're carrying it like it's still happening, like Damien's still in your life, still a threat, still controlling your every move. Your brain hasn't caught up to the fact that the situation's changed. He's out on bail. He could violate his restraining order and go back to jail immediately. He could try to contact you and trigger about 15 different felony charges. He could breathe wrong and have his bond revoked. Dr. Reeves leaned forward. Or he could sit in his lawyer's office and plan his defense like a rational person trying to avoid federal prison. Which do you think is more likely? Alara wanted to say the first option. Wanted to believe that Damien was irrational, uncontrollable, that he'd come after her regardless of consequences. But that wasn't true, and she knew it. Damien had always been calculating, strategic. He'd hurt her in ways that didn't show, in places where bruises could be hidden. He'd isolated her systematically, cutting off friends and family until she had nowhere to run. Every act of violence had been deliberate. He's smarter than people think, Alara said quietly. Then he's smart enough to know that coming after you now would be suicide. His lawyers are probably telling him to sit still, look repentant, and hope the jury believes he's changed. Dr. Reeves made a note. Which means the threat you're feeling isn't about what he's actually doing. It's about what your nervous system remembers. So what do I do about it? We start by getting you to sleep. Then we work on retraining your brain to understand that you're not in danger every second of every day. She pulled a prescription pad from her bag. I'm going to write you something for the nightmares. Short term, just to break the cycle. And I want to see you twice a week until the trial. I don't need... Yes, you do. And arguing about it wastes both our time. Dr. Reeves signed the prescription and handed it over. Take one at night. Don't mix it with alcohol. Don't drive after taking it. And if you start feeling worse instead of better, call me immediately. She left 20 minutes later, and Alara sat there holding a prescription for sleep like it was a lifeline she hadn't known she needed. Lucien came by that evening to check on her. He'd started doing that, showing up unannounced, never staying long, always with some excuse about security protocols or case updates. Dr. Reeves said you actually talked, he said, leaning against the kitchen counter. She didn't give me much choice. She's good at that. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. This came for you today, delivered to the federal building. Alara took it with hands that immediately started shaking. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. No return address. Should I open this? We already scanned it. It's safe. Just paper. Lucien's expression was carefully neutral. It's from one of the other victims, Rachel Torres, the woman from the photos, the one who'd pressed charges 4 years ago and had her life destroyed for it. Alara opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper covered in cramped handwriting. Dear Alara, I don't know if this is weird, reaching out like this. The prosecutors gave me your name and said you're the one who finally got them to listen. I wanted to say thank you. I tried to fight back once, told the truth, went to the police, filed reports, did everything you're supposed to do when someone hurts you, and they buried me, made me look crazy, made me disappear. I've been hiding for 4 years, working jobs under fake names, moving every time someone looks at me too long, living like I'm the one who did something wrong. But now there's a trial. Now there's evidence. Now there are 43 of us instead of just me screaming into the void. I'm going to testify. I'm going to stand up in that courtroom and tell them what Damien Crowe did to me. And when I do, I'm going to think about you, about how you were brave enough to let someone help you. Thank you for not staying silent. Rachel Alara read it twice before she could speak. There are 43 women like me, 43 that we've found, probably more who haven't come forward yet. Lucien's voice was quiet. The Crows have been doing this for 30 years. Damien learned from his father, who probably learned from his father. It's generational. How do you live with that, knowing you could have stopped it sooner? I didn't know about them sooner. And beating myself up for not being omniscient doesn't help the women who need justice now. He straightened. But yeah, it keeps me up at night sometimes. Alara folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope. Rachel said I was brave. I don't feel brave. Brave people rarely do. They just keep moving forward because the alternative is worse. Is that what you tell yourself? Every day. He checked his watch. I need to go. Meeting with the legal team. You good here? She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. After he left, Alara took one of Dr. Reeves's pills and fell asleep for the first time in a week without dreaming about hands around her throat. The prosecution started building their case in earnest. Sarah Chen called Alara in 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, each session more detailed than the last. They went through phone records, text messages, emails. Every piece of communication between Alara and Damien got analyzed, dissected, weaponized. He texted you 47 times in one day, Sarah said, pulling up the records, after you'd already told him to leave you alone. Alara remembered that day. She'd been 3 weeks into her new life, working at the coffee shop, starting to believe she might actually be safe. Then her phone had started buzzing, over and over, messages that started sweet and turned threatening by message 20. I blocked his number after that, she said, and he created 3 new numbers to get around the block. Then he showed up at your apartment. I called the police. Report says they talked to him and he left. No arrest, no restraining order. Sarah's expression was grim. The responding officer was someone Judge Crow played golf with. He made sure nothing came of it. The corruption ran deeper than Alara had imagined. Every system she'd tried to use for help had been compromised. Every door she'd knocked on had been locked from the inside by men who valued connections over justice. How did any of you get away with this for so long? She asked Sarah during one session. Because people don't want to believe it's happening. Rich family, respected judge, charming son. It's easier to think the victims are lying than to accept that monsters can look like everyone else. Sarah closed her laptop. That's what makes this case important. We're not just prosecuting the Crows, we're prosecuting a system that enabled them. 3 weeks into preparation, Lucian showed up at Alara's door at midnight. She almost didn't answer, but he knocked in a pattern, 3 quick, 2 slow, that he'd told her to memorize. The signal that it was actually him and not a threat. She opened the door to find him looking like he'd been in a fight. His knuckles were scraped. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. What happened? Damien decided to test his restraining order. Lucien pushed past her, went straight to the sink, started running cold water over his hands. Showed up outside your old apartment building, the one where Mrs. Chen lives. Alara's stomach dropped. Is she, She's fine. I was already there. Had been watching the building since his bail went through. He grabbed a dish towel, pressed it against his knuckles. He tried to get inside. I stopped him. You hit him. He swung first. I just returned the favor. Lucien's smile was sharp. His lawyers are probably filing assault charges as we speak. I don't care. He violated the restraining order. That's automatic bond revocation. He's going back to jail? Already there. I called Morrison before I even left the scene. She had units there in 5 minutes. He tossed the bloody towel on the counter. He's done. No more bail. No more chances. He stays locked up until trial. Alara should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something closer to vertigo. Why was he at Mrs. Chen's building? Lucien's expression darkened. Because he knew it would hurt you. Couldn't get to you directly, so he went after the person you protected. But she doesn't need protecting. The judge lied about. Damien doesn't know that, or doesn't care. He just wanted to send a message. Lucien leaned against the counter, looking tired. The message being that even in jail, even with an ankle monitor, even with federal charges hanging over his head, he could still find ways to make you afraid. It worked. I know, that's why I'm here. He straightened. I'm staying tonight. On your couch. Don't argue. She didn't have the energy to argue. Lucien made himself at home with the ease of someone who'd done this before. Pulled a gun from somewhere, she hadn't even realized he was armed, and set it on the coffee table like it was car keys. Kicked off his boots, stretched out on the couch that was too small for his frame. You do this a lot? Alara asked from the bedroom doorway. Sleep on couches? More than I sleep in beds. He closed his eyes. Get some rest. I'll be gone before you wake up. She wanted to ask why he was doing this, why he cared, why he dedicated his life to fighting battles for strangers. But she already knew the answer. Emma, the sister who didn't get saved. Alara went to bed and actually slept, knowing someone was standing guard between her and the world. When she woke up, he was gone. But there was fresh coffee in the pot and a note on the counter. Damien's bail was revoked. He's in county lockup until trial. You're safe. Safe. That word again. Alara crumpled the note and threw it away. Then she poured herself coffee and tried to figure out what safe was supposed to feel like. The weeks blurred together. Therapy sessions with Dr. Reeves, prep sessions with Sarah, occasional visits from Morrison checking on her safety, and Lucien, always Lucien, showing up at random times with food or information or just his presence. You know you don't have to babysit me, Alara said one evening when he'd appeared with Thai food for the third time that week. I'm not babysitting. I'm making sure you eat. He handed her a container. You've lost weight. How would you know? Because I pay attention. He said it without embarrassment. You're not sleeping as much as you should, not eating regularly, spending too much time alone in your head. I'm processing. You're spiraling. There's a difference. He sat down across from her. Talk to me. About what? About whatever's making you look like you want to walk into traffic. Alara picked at her food. I got another letter today from one of the victims. And she thanked me. Again, like I did something heroic. She set down her fork. I didn't do anything. I was just trying to survive. You're the one who built the case. You're the one who exposed them. I was just there. Lucien was quiet for a moment. You think Rachel Torres was just there? Or Monica Stevens? Or any of the other 42 women who are testifying? They're brave. They chose to come forward. After you did. After they saw that someone actually believed a victim for once. That someone was willing to fight. He leaned forward. You didn't ask for this. But you're carrying it anyway. That's not nothing. It feels like nothing. That's trauma talking, not truth. He stood, started clearing containers. You want to know what I see when I look at you? Not really. I see someone who survived something that kills people. Who got forced back into hell and still found the strength to walk away when I gave her the chance. Who's spending 6 months in limbo, reliving her worst memories so that 43 other women can have justice. He met her eyes. That's not nothing. That's everything. Alara's throat tightened. You're just saying that because it's your job. My job is security consulting. Emotional support is extra. His mouth quirked. And I don't waste words on things I don't mean. After he left, Alara sat in the quiet apartment and tried to believe him. 4 months into waiting, Sarah called an emergency meeting. Alara showed up at the federal building to find the conference room packed. All 43 victims in one space for the first time. Women ranging from early 20s to late 50s. Different backgrounds, different stories, all connected by the same thread of violence and corruption. Sarah stood at the head of the table. The defense just filed a motion to separate the trials. They want Damien tried separately from his father. They're claiming the trafficking charges are unrelated to the domestic violence cases. A woman across the table, Monica, Alara had learned her name in group prep sessions, spoke up. Can they do that? They can try. The judge will rule on it next week. Sarah's expression was hard. If the motion succeeds, it weakens both cases, separates the pattern of abuse from the larger corruption, makes it easier for them to claim Damien's just a troubled individual and his father's just a judge who made some bad calls. So what do we do? Rachel asked. She'd flown in from Atlanta for the meeting. Looked smaller in person than Alara had imagined. We fight it. We submit affidavits showing how the cases are connected, how Judge Crow's corruption directly enabled Damien's abuse, how the trafficking network used the same intimidation tactics as the domestic violence cases. Sarah looked around the table, and we show them that separating us doesn't make us weaker, it makes us angrier. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, Alara had heard stories that made her own nightmare feel almost manageable. Women who'd been trafficked across state lines. Women who'd been threatened with deportation, job loss, custody battles. Women who'd tried to speak up and been crushed so thoroughly they'd spent years believing they deserved it. When it ended, Rachel approached her in the hallway. "I wanted to meet you in person," she said. She was shorter than Alara, with dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. "To say thank you for real." "You already wrote me a letter." "Letters are easy. This is harder." Rachel twisted her hands together. "I've been running for 4 years, and watching you stand still, face this head on, it made me realize I was tired of running. I'm not standing still by choice. I'm stuck here until trial." "Maybe, but you're not hiding. You're not pretending it didn't happen. You're not letting them make you disappear." Rachel's voice cracked. "That's what I needed to see, that it was possible to stop running." Other women approached, shared their stories, thanked her for something she still didn't feel like she'd done. By the time Alara left the building, she felt like she'd been hit by a truck. Lucien was waiting by his car. He took one look at her face and didn't ask questions, just opened the passenger door and drove her back to the safe house in silence. "They all think I'm some kind of hero," Alara said when they were almost there. "You are." "I'm not. I'm just someone who got saved. You did all the work." Lucien pulled up to the curb, put the car in park, turned to face her. "I gave you information and an exit. You're the one who took it. You're the one who stood at that altar and said no in front of 300 people. You're the one who's sitting through depositions and prep sessions reliving the worst moments of your life so other women can see justice." His expression was fierce. "I don't save people, Alara. I give them tools. What they do with those tools is up to them, and you're using yours to burn down an empire." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist she was just a victim who got lucky. But sitting there in his car, watching him look at her like she was someone worth fighting for, she started to wonder if maybe he was right. The judge denied the motion to separate trials. Sarah called Alara with the news 3 days later, her voice tight with victory. "We're going forward as planned. All charges, all defendants, one trial. The defense is going to appeal, but it won't matter. We're moving to trial date in 6 weeks." 6 weeks? Alara hung up and stared at the calendar on her wall. 6 weeks until she had to stand in front of a courtroom and tell her story to strangers. 6 weeks until Damien's lawyers tried to destroy her credibility. 6 weeks until everything she'd been building toward either succeeded or collapsed. Dr. Reeves increased their sessions to 3 times a week. "You're going to need more support as we get closer. The anxiety is only going to get worse." She was right. Alara's nightmares came back with a vengeance. Sleep became something she had to fight for every night. Food tasted like cardboard. The safe house started to feel like a prison. Lucien noticed. Of course he noticed. "You need to get out," he said one afternoon, showing up unannounced again. "Take a walk, see the city. Remember there's a world outside these walls." "I can't. What if nothing? Damien's in county lockup. The judge is in federal detention. Their entire network is under surveillance. You're safe." He grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door. "Come on, I'm taking you somewhere." He drove her to the Battery, where Charleston's old money met the harbor and tourists took pictures of mansions that had been standing since before the country existed. They walked along the seawall while the sun set over the water and sailboats drifted past like ghosts. "I used to come here with Emma," Lucien said quietly, "before everything went bad. She loved watching the sunset." "What was she like?" "Stubborn, funny, believed the best in people even when they didn't deserve it." He stared out at the water. "She would have liked you." "You don't know that." "Yeah, I do. She had a thing for strays. Always bringing home broken things and trying to fix them." His smile was sad. "I used to tell her not everyone wanted to be fixed. She'd say that was fine. She'd just keep them company while they fixed themselves." They stood there in silence while the sun turned the harbor gold and then red and then purple. "I'm scared," Alara said finally. "About the trial. About testifying. About what happens after." "Good. Fear means you're paying attention." Lucien turned to face her. "But don't let it paralyze you. Use it. Let it remind you why you're doing this." "Why am I doing this?" "Because 43 women are watching. Because every victim who comes after you needs to know that speaking up is worth it. Because the crows need to learn that money and power don't make you untouchable." He paused. "And because you deserve to watch them burn for what they did to you." Alara looked at him. This man who'd invaded her life and dismantled her nightmare and refused to let her give up even when she wanted to. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" For not letting me disappear. Lucian's expression softened. That was never an option. They stayed until full dark, then drove back to the safe house where Alara's temporary life waited. 6 weeks until trial. 6 weeks until everything changed. She went inside, locked the door, and started counting down the days. The courthouse smelled like old wood and older secrets. Alara stood outside the main entrance on a Tuesday morning in late October, watching people stream past with briefcases and coffee cups and the casual confidence of those who belonged in places like this. She didn't feel like she belonged. She felt like an exhibit, evidence, something to be examined and cross-examined and picked apart until there was nothing left but the truth, raw and bleeding. "You ready?" Lucian asked beside her. She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. Inside, security wanded them down and checked bags and treated everyone like potential threats. Sarah met them on the other side, looking sharp in a navy suit that probably cost more than Alara's monthly rent used to be. "The jury's been seated," she said, walking them toward the elevators. 12 people, 6 alternates, good mix. We got lucky with the selection." "Lucky how?" Alara asked. 3 of the jurors have daughters. 2 have sisters who have been in abusive relationships. One's a retired social worker. Sarah pressed the button for the 4th floor. "The defense tried to strike them all. Judge denied it. Said excluding anyone with personal experience would eliminate half the county." The elevator rose with a hum that made Alara's stomach drop. She could feel the walls closing in already, and they hadn't even entered the courtroom yet. The hallway outside was packed with people, reporters, victims, family members of both sides. Alara spotted Damien's mother sitting on a bench, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief like she was the one suffering. The woman looked up as they passed, and her expression shifted from grief to something uglier. "Whore," she hissed, just loud enough for Alara to hear. Lucian stepped between them without breaking stride. "Keep walking," he said quietly. Inside the courtroom, the space felt both too big and too small. High ceilings that made voices echo. Rows of benches that could seat hundreds. A judge's bench elevated like a throne. And at the defense table, Damien and his father sat with their lawyers, looking like they'd just walked out of a board meeting instead of jail cells. Damien saw her first. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Possession. The look he used to give her when she came home 5 minutes late, and he was calculating whether to punish her now or wait until they had privacy. Alara forced herself to look away. Sarah guided her to the prosecution table where the other lead attorneys were already organizing files. Behind them, the gallery was filling up with victims. 43 women who'd flown in from 6 different states to watch justice happen, or fail to happen. Rachel caught Alara's eye from the second row and gave her a small nod. Monica sat beside her. Others Alara had met during prep sessions filled the remaining seats like a silent army. "All rise." Judge Catherine Martinez entered from the side door, her black robe making her look both severe and unstoppable. She was 60, had been on the bench for 20 years, and according to Sarah, had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense from anyone. Alara stood with everyone else and tried to breathe normally. "Please be seated," Martinez said, settling behind the bench. "We're here in the matter of the United States versus Alistair Crowe and Damien Crowe. Are both sides ready to proceed?" "The prosecution is ready, Your Honor," Sarah said. "Defense is ready," replied a man who looked like he charged by the syllable. Marcus Webb, lead defense attorney, had silver hair and a smile that suggested he'd gotten rich making juries forget what defendants had actually done. Martinez nodded. "Opening statements. Prosecution, you may begin." Sarah stood and for a moment just looked at the jury, let the silence stretch until they were all paying attention. Then she spoke. "This case is about power, about how it's used and how it's abused, about what happens when men who are supposed to uphold the law decide they are the law." She moved toward the jury box slowly. Alistair Crowe spent 30 years as a federal judge. In that time, he made decisions that affected thousands of lives. He was trusted, respected, given authority that most people never receive. She paused. He used that authority to build a criminal empire, to traffic women across state lines, to bury evidence of his son's violence, to threaten, intimidate, and destroy anyone who tried to stop him. Sarah walked back to the prosecution table, picked up a folder. "You're going to hear from 43 women over the next few weeks. Women who were victimized by Damian Crowe and protected from justice by his father. Women who tried to speak up and were silenced. Women who ran and were hunted down. Women who thought they were alone until they realized they were part of a pattern 30 years in the making. She set the folder down and looked at Damian directly. The defense is going to tell you these women are lying, that they're after money, that they're bitter exes with axes to grind. Sarah's voice hardened. But you don't get 43 bitter exes all telling the same story unless that story is true. You don't get bank records showing payoffs to witnesses unless there was something to hide. You don't get recorded conversations of a federal judge threatening deportation and false imprisonment unless that judge was willing to do anything to protect his son. She turned back to the jury. This isn't a case about he said, she said. This is a case about evidence, documentation. Proof that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And by the end of this trial, you're going to see exactly how much damage two men can do when they believe they're above the law. Sarah sat down. Alara realized she'd been holding her breath. Marcus Webb stood next, buttoning his suit jacket with the careful precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He smiled at the jury like they were old friends. Ladies and gentlemen, what you just heard was a compelling story, and I use the word story deliberately. He moved to the center of the room, because that's what this is. A narrative constructed by the prosecution to make my clients look like villains instead of what they actually are. Flawed human beings caught in the crossfire of a vindictive campaign. He gestured toward Damian. My client made mistakes. He'll be the first to admit that. His relationships were messy, complicated. Sometimes they ended badly. But messy relationships are not crimes. Complicated breakups are not federal offenses. And having an ex-girlfriend who's angry doesn't make you a criminal. Webb walked toward the jury box. The prosecution wants you to believe there's a pattern here. 43 women, they say. All victimized, all telling the same story. He paused. But what they're not telling you is that many of these women were contacted by the same private investigator, a man named Lucien Moretti, who has a personal vendetta against successful men from wealthy families. A man who coached them, led them, convinced them to turn normal relationship difficulties into federal charges. Alara felt Lucien tense beside her, but his expression didn't change. As for Judge Crowe, Webb continued, you're going to hear allegations about corruption, about using his position to protect his son. But what you're actually going to see is a father who believed in his child, who gave him second chances, who, yes, maybe made some calls he shouldn't have made, but did so out of love, not malice. That's not corruption, that's being human. He walked back to the defense table. By the end of this trial, you're going to see that this case is built on exaggerations, coached testimony, and the ambitions of a prosecutor trying to make a name for herself by taking down a prominent family. And when you see that, I trust you'll do the right thing and find my clients not guilty. He sat down looking satisfied. The first witness was Rachel Torres. She walked to the stand like she was walking to her own execution, pale and shaking, eyes fixed on some point above the judge's head. After she was sworn in, Sarah approached gently. Ms. Torres, can you tell us about your relationship with Damian Crowe? Rachel's voice was barely audible. We dated for 8 months. I was 24. He was 30. How did you meet? At a fundraiser. He was charming, funny, paid attention to me in a way that felt special. She twisted her hands together. At first, everything was perfect. When did things change? About 2 months in. He got angry when I went out with friends without telling him. Said I was being disrespectful. That if I loved him, I'd want to spend all my time with him. Rachel's voice cracked. I thought it meant he cared. I didn't realize it was control. Sarah walked her through the relationship, the escalation. The first time Damian grabbed her hard enough to leave marks. The apologies that came after. The cycle of violence and remorse that repeated until Rachel couldn't tell which version of him was real. Did you try to get help? Sarah asked. I went to the police after he broke my collarbone, filed a report. They took photos of my injuries, told me they'd investigate. Rachel looked at Damian for the first time. 2 days later, a detective called and said they were dropping the case, said there wasn't enough evidence, that it was my word against his and he had witnesses who said I was unstable. Did you pursue charges anyway? I tried, got a lawyer, started building a case. Rachel's hands were shaking now. Then Judge Crow showed up at my apartment. Told me if I didn't drop everything, he'd make sure I never worked in this city again. That he'd destroy my reputation so thoroughly no one would ever believe anything I said. What did you do? I ran, changed my name, moved to Atlanta, spent 4 years looking over my shoulder. Tears were streaming down Rachel's face now, until I got a call from Mr. Moretti saying it was finally safe to come forward. Sarah let that sit for a moment. Thank you, Ms. Torres. No further questions. Marcus Webb stood for cross-examination with the expression of a shark who'd just smelled blood. Ms. Torres, you said Mr. Crow was charming at first. Would you say you pursued him? Rachel blinked. What? Simple question. Did you pursue the relationship, ask him out, initiate contact? We met at a fundraiser. We both, yes or no, Ms. Torres. Did you pursue him? I guess, maybe. And when the relationship ended, were you upset? Of course I was upset. He upset enough to want revenge? Sarah shot to her feet. Objection, badgering the witness. Sustained, Martinez said. Mr. Webb, ask your questions without the editorializing. Webb nodded like he'd expected that. Ms. Torres, how much money did Mr. Moretti offer you to testify? He didn't offer me anything. No compensation at all? No payments for your time, travel expenses? The prosecution covered travel, that's it. And did Mr. Moretti coach you on what to say today? He helped me prepare for yes or no. He helped me remember what happened. He didn't tell me what to say. Webb smiled like he'd just proven something. No further questions. Rachel left the stand looking smaller than when she'd arrived. The prosecution called 6 more witnesses that day. Each one told similar stories. Charm that turned to control. Violence that escalated. Attempts to get help that were systematically dismantled by Judge Crow's interference. By the time court adjourned, Alara felt like she'd been beaten with facts. The stories were too familiar, too close to her own experience. Watching these women relive their trauma made her aware that she'd have to do the same thing soon. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Questions got shouted from every direction. Ms. Vance, how do you feel about the testimony today? Do you think justice will be served? Is it true you were forced into a wedding? Lucienne got her to the car before she had to answer any of them. Morrison was waiting, engine running, ready to extract them from the chaos. You okay? She asked as they pulled into traffic. Alara didn't know how to answer that. She was nauseated and angry and sad and relieved all at once. Watching Rachel testify had been both validating and horrifying. Knowing she'd have to do the same made her want to throw up. I'm here, she said finally. That's the best I've got. Morrison nodded like that made sense. Back at the safe house, Lucian made dinner while Alara sat on the couch and stared at nothing. She could hear him moving around the kitchen, the sound of chopping and sizzling and water running. Domestic sounds that felt surreal in the middle of a federal trial. Eat, he said, setting a plate in front of her. Pasta with vegetables. Simple. The kind of thing she could force down even with her stomach in knots. They ate in silence for a while. Then Lucienne spoke. You don't have to testify if you don't want to. Alara looked up. What? Sarah has enough without you. 42 other witnesses, the recordings, the documentation. You could sit this out and the case would still hold. He set down his fork. I'm not saying you should. I'm saying you have a choice. Those other women testified because I came forward first. If I don't follow through, they'd understand. Rachel would understand. All of them would. His expression was serious. This isn't about obligation. It's about whether you want to do this for yourself. Alara thought about that. About standing in front of a courtroom full of strangers and telling them about the worst things that had ever happened to her. About Damien's lawyers trying to tear her apart. About his mother calling her a whore in hallways while cameras recorded everything. But she also thought about the letter Rachel had sent. About the women who'd thanked her for giving them courage. About the fact that staying silent had nearly killed her and speaking up had saved her life. I want to testify, she said. You sure? No. But I'm going to do it anyway. Lucian nodded like he'd expected that answer. Then we'll make sure you're ready. The trial continued for 2 more weeks before Alara was called. She watched from the gallery as witness after witness took the stand, heard stories that made her stomach turn. saw evidence that documented decades of corruption and violence. The defense fought every piece of it, attacking credibility, suggesting ulterior motives, doing everything they could to create reasonable doubt. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing payments to witnesses who'd agreed to recant testimony. Recorded phone calls where Judge Crow explicitly threatened deportation and false imprisonment. Medical records documenting injuries that Damien had caused and later denied. A paper trail so extensive that even Marcus Webb's considerable skills couldn't explain it away. When Sarah finally called Alara to the stand, the courtroom went quiet. She walked to the witness box on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, put her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, sat down and looked at the jury, 12 strangers who would decide whether her pain mattered. "State your name for the record," the court reporter said. "Alara Vance." Sarah approached with a gentle expression. "Ms. Vance, can you tell us how you met Damien Crow?" And Alara started talking. She told them about the gallery opening, about how Damien had pursued her with flowers and attention and all the romance she'd been starved for, about the early days when she'd believed she was falling in love. Then she told them about the first time he'd hurt her. "We were at dinner with his parents," she said, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "I laughed at something the waiter said. Just a normal laugh. But after we got back to his apartment, Damien grabbed my arm and slammed me against the wall, said I'd embarrassed him, that I'd been flirting." She looked at the jury. "I had a bruise the shape of his hand for 2 weeks." Sarah walked her through the relationship, every escalation, every injury, every time Alara had tried to leave and been pulled back by promises and threats, and the kind of manipulation that made her doubt her own reality. "When did you finally leave?" Sarah asked. "After he broke 3 of my ribs and fractured my arm. I was in the hospital for 4 days. When I got out, I packed what I could carry and left everything else behind." Alara's voice cracked. "I changed my name, moved to a different city, got a job at a coffee shop. I just wanted to disappear." "But you didn't disappear." "No. Judge Crow found me. Showed up at the coffee shop where I worked and told me I was going to marry Damien or he'd destroy my life and the life of an innocent woman I cared about." Sarah pulled up the recording, the one Lucien had made using the bug necklace, played it for the jury. Alara's voice came through the speakers, small and scared. Then the judge's voice, calm and clinical, laying out exactly how he planned to destroy her if she didn't comply. When it ended, several jurors were crying. "What did you do after that conversation?" Sarah asked. "I said yes, because I was terrified, because I believed him, because I thought I had no choice." Alara looked at Damien. "I would have married you, would have spent the rest of my life being your victim, if Lucien hadn't stopped it." Sarah let that hang for a moment. No further questions. Marcus Webb stood for cross-examination, looking less confident than he had with the other witnesses. Alara represented something different. She was the woman from the wedding, the one whose nightmare had been broadcast to the world. Attacking her credibility was going to be harder, but he tried anyway. "Ms. Vance, you and my client dated for how long?" 2 years? "And during those 2 years you lived with him?" "Part of the time." "You accepted gifts from him? Expensive gifts?" "Yes." "You attended events with his family, were photographed together at charity functions?" "Yes." "To the outside world, you looked like a happy couple." Alara met his eyes. "Abusers don't advertise what they do. They save it for private moments when there are no witnesses." Webb's expression tightened. "You claim my client broke your ribs. Do you have documentation of that?" "Hospital records, x-rays, medical reports, all submitted as evidence." "And did you tell the doctors at the time that my client caused those injuries?" "No, I was too scared." "And so you lied to medical professionals?" "I protected myself the only way I knew how." Webb changed tactics. "When you left my client, did you take any of the gifts he'd given you?" "Some clothes, personal items." "Jewelry?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I didn't want anything from him. I wanted to be free." "But you kept the apartment he'd been paying for." "I kept it for 3 weeks until I could afford to move. Then I left." Webb paced. "Ms. Vance, isn't it true that you asked Mr. Moretti to help you get revenge on my client?" "No." "You never spoke to him about wanting to hurt Damien Crow?" "I never spoke to him about anything until the wedding. I didn't know who he was." Alara's voice was stronger now. "He noticed I was in trouble and he investigated. That's what he does. I didn't ask for his help, but I'm grateful I got it. Webb tried for another 20 minutes, picked at details, suggested ulterior motives, implied she was exaggerating for sympathy. Alara answered every question with the same calm clarity. Finally, he gave up. No further questions. Alara left the stand feeling like she'd just survived something. The courtroom was silent except for someone crying in the gallery. She didn't look back at Damien, didn't give him the satisfaction of her attention. She walked back to the prosecution table and sat down beside Sarah, who squeezed her hand once. "You did good," she whispered. The trial continued for another week. The prosecution called experts on domestic violence, on coercion, on the psychology of abuse, called FBI agents who testified about the trafficking network, called forensic accountants who walked the jury through money trails that connected everything. The defense tried to create doubt, suggested the victims were coached, implied the investigation was politically motivated, brought character witnesses who testified that the Crows were upstanding citizens. But the evidence was too strong. When both sides rested and closing arguments finished, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. Alara waited in a conference room with the other victims, drinking bad coffee and trying not to think about what would happen if the verdict went the wrong way. Rachel sat beside her, silent and tense. Monica paced by the windows. Others talked in quiet voices or stared at their phones or just sat there looking like they were holding their breath. When Morrison finally came to get them, her expression was unreadable. "Jury's back," was all she said. They filed into the courtroom like soldiers going to war, took their seats in the gallery while the jury filed in looking exhausted and serious. Judge Martinez called the court to order. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman stood. "We have, Your Honor. In the matter of the United States versus Alistair Crowe, on the charge of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, how do you find?" "Guilty." The word hit like thunder. The forewoman continued through all 27 charges against the judge, guilty on every single one. Then she moved to Damien. "In the matter of the United States versus Damien Crowe, on the charge of aggravated assault, how do you find?" "Guilty." Guilty on all charges. Every count of assault, battery, stalking, intimidation, conspiracy. Guilty. The courtroom exploded with sound, crying, cheering, Damien's mother wailing like someone had died, reporters scrambling for the exits to file their stories. Alara sat there and felt nothing. Then everything. Relief crashed through her like a wave, followed by something that felt like grief. It was over. Actually over. The men who destroyed so many lives were going to prison. Justice had actually happened. Rachel grabbed her hand and Alara realized she was crying. "We did it," Rachel whispered. "We actually did it." Around them, 43 women held each other and cried and laughed and tried to process the fact that they'd won. Judge Martinez was banging her gavel, calling for order. When the room finally quieted, she looked at both defendants. "Sentencing will be scheduled for 6 weeks from today. Until then, both defendants will remain in custody without bail." Her expression was steel. Court is adjourned. Damien was led away in handcuffs, still looking like he couldn't believe this was happening to him. His father followed, smaller now, defeated in a way that suggested he'd finally realized his power was gone. Outside the courthouse, the press was waiting, but this time Alara didn't hide. She stood with the other victims while Sarah gave a statement about justice and accountability and the importance of believing survivors. Lucien stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. When Alara caught his eye, he nodded once. She nodded back. That night, back at the safe house, Alara sat on the couch with a glass of wine she'd bought to celebrate and tried to figure out what came next. The trial was over. The verdict was in. In 6 weeks, Damien and his father would be sentenced, and she could finally move on with her life. But moving on required knowing where to move to. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. "Thank you for standing with us. You changed everything." Then Monica. "We're planning a dinner next week. All of us. To celebrate. You should come." More messages flooded in. Women she'd testified alongside. Women she barely knew but was connected to by the worst kind of bond. She responded to each one, feeling something that might have been hope. When Lucien showed up an hour later with food he'd picked up from somewhere, Alara was still sitting in the same spot, phone in hand, crying for reasons she couldn't quite name. "Hey," he said, setting down the food and sitting beside her. "You okay?" "I don't know what I am." She wiped her eyes. "It's over. They're guilty. Everything we worked for actually happened, and I just feel empty." "That's normal. You've been running on adrenaline for months. Now that it's done, your body's trying to figure out what to do with itself." He handed her a napkin. "Give it time. The emotions will catch up." They sat in silence for a while. Then Alara spoke. "What happens to you now? Do you just move on to the next case?" "Eventually, but not immediately." He looked at her. "I'm going to make sure you're settled first, that you have somewhere safe to go, that the resources are in place for whatever comes next." "You don't have to do that." "I know, but I'm going to anyway." Alara studied his face, this man who'd burned down her nightmare and refused to let her thank him for it. "Why do you really do this? And don't say it's about your sister. That's part of it, but there's more." Lucien was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Because I couldn't save her, and I can't bring her back, but I can make sure other women don't end up like she did. That's not redemption, but it's something. It's more than something. Maybe." He stood, started unpacking food. "Come on, eat. Tomorrow we start figuring out your next chapter." They ate Chinese food and watched terrible television, and didn't talk about trials or verdicts or what came next. For one night, they just existed, and for Alara, that was enough. Sentencing day came 6 weeks later on a gray December morning that threatened snow but never quite delivered. Alara stood outside the courthouse again, this time without the knot of fear that had lived in her stomach for months. She wasn't testifying today, wasn't being cross-examined or picked apart. Today, she was just a witness to consequences. Rachel stood beside her, along with Monica and 15 other women who'd made the trip back to Charleston for this final act. They'd formed something over the past months, not quite friendship, but a bond forged in shared trauma and collective survival. A group chat that stayed active at all hours. Phone calls when the nightmares got bad. The understanding that some things didn't need to be explained because they'd all lived them. "You think they'll get the maximum?" Rachel asked, her breath fogging in the cold air. Sarah said the judge is furious, that the evidence of the trafficking network pushed this into territory that guarantees serious time. Alara pulled her coat tighter. "But I've learned not to count on anything until it's done." They filed inside, through security that had become familiar, into the courtroom that now felt less like a place of judgment and more like a stage where a very specific kind of theater played out. Judge Martinez was already seated, looking through documents with an expression that suggested she'd spent considerable time deciding exactly how much punishment to deliver. Damien and his father sat at the defense table with their lawyers, both wearing suits that probably cost more than Alara's car, but the suits couldn't hide what months in custody had done to them. Damien looked thinner, harder, like prison had stripped away the polish and revealed something meaner underneath. The judge looked old in a way he hadn't before, shoulders curved forward, hands shaking slightly when he reached for water. Sarah caught Alara's eye from the prosecution table and gave a small nod. They'd won, but winning didn't erase what had been done. It just meant the score was finally being settled. Martinez called the court to order and the room fell silent. "We're here for sentencing in the United States versus Alistair Crow and Damien Crow. Before I proceed, I'm going to allow victim impact statements. The prosecution has submitted written statements from 38 victims. I've read them all." She looked at Sarah. "Who will be speaking today?" 3 victims have requested to speak in person, Your Honor. Rachel Torres, Monica Stevens, and Alara Vance. Martinez nodded. "Ms. Torres, please approach." Rachel walked to the podium on legs that looked steadier than they had during the trial. She'd cut her hair since then, dyed it a different color, done something that made her look less like someone hiding and more like someone ready to be seen. "My name is Rachel Torres," she said, her voice carrying through the courtroom. 4 years ago, I pressed charges against Damien Crow for breaking my collarbone and threatening my life. Those charges disappeared because his father used his position to make them go away. I lost my job, my apartment, my sense of safety. I spent 4 years living under a different name, working jobs that paid cash because I was too scared to exist in any official capacity. She looked at Damien. "You took 4 years of my life. You made me believe I was worthless. that what happened to me didn't matter, that men like you could do whatever you wanted and face no consequences. Her voice didn't shake. But you were wrong. It did matter. And today you're going to learn that actions have consequences even when your father is a judge. She stepped down and Monica took her place. Monica was older than Rachel, mid-40s, with the kind of presence that suggested she'd rebuilt herself from scratch multiple times. I met Damian Crow when I was 38 and stupid enough to believe that successful men were safe men. He put me in the hospital twice. The second time, I tried to file a police report and was told there wasn't enough evidence, that it was my word against his, that maybe I should reconsider what I was accusing him of. She paused. I later found out that the officer who discouraged me from filing was someone Judge Crow played golf with, that the detective assigned to my case received a donation to his campaign from Crow family funds. The system that was supposed to protect me had been bought and paid for. Monica's expression hardened. I'm here today to say that you can't buy your way out of this, that every woman you hurt is standing here watching you face justice, and that we will carry this victory for the rest of our lives. Then it was Alara's turn. She walked to the podium feeling the weight of 43 women's stories on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. It had never been just about her. But she was the one who'd been standing at the altar when Lucian walked through those doors. She was the one whose wedding had become a federal case. And she was the one who needed to finish this. My name is Alara Vance, she said, and I almost married my abuser because a federal judge threatened to destroy my life if I didn't. She let that sit for a moment. Damian Crow broke 3 of my ribs and fractured my arm. He held me underwater until I thought I was going to die. He isolated me from everyone I knew and convinced me that I deserved everything he did to me. And when I finally escaped, his father found me and forced me back into a nightmare I'd spent 2 years trying to forget. Alara looked at Judge Crow. You used your power to hurt people, to protect a predator, to build a system where violence went unpunished because you decided it should. You took an oath to uphold the law, and instead you corrupted it so thoroughly that dozens of women suffered because you valued your son's freedom more than their lives. She turned to Damian. And you learned from him. Learned that power means you can do whatever you want, that hurting people is acceptable as long as you're charming enough afterward, that women exist to be controlled and punished and discarded when they stop being useful. Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped the podium hard enough to hurt. But you were wrong. We're not disposable, we're not silent, and we're not going away. She stepped down and walked back to her seat, feeling lighter than she had in months. Martinez waited until the room settled before speaking. I've presided over federal cases for 20 years. I've seen corruption. I've seen violence. I've seen men use power to hurt vulnerable people. But this case, she paused, looking at both defendants. This case represents a level of systemic abuse that I have rarely encountered. A federal judge using his position to facilitate his son's violence. A trafficking network that operated for decades because the man who should have been stopping it was running it. Dozens of women whose lives were destroyed because 2 men believed they were above accountability. She looked at the sentencing guidelines in front of her. Alistair Crow, you have been found guilty of 27 federal charges, including conspiracy to commit human trafficking, obstruction of justice, bribery, and abuse of power. The prosecution has recommended 40 years. The defense has requested 15 with consideration for your age and prior public service. Martinez's expression was ice. I'm sentencing you to 55 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. You will serve this sentence in a maximum security facility. You will surrender all pension benefits and face asset forfeiture to establish a victim compensation fund. Damian's mother let out a wail from the gallery, but Martinez continued without pause. Damian Crow, you have been found guilty of 18 charges, including aggravated assault, stalking, conspiracy, and witness intimidation. The prosecution has recommended 30 years. The defense has requested 10. She looked at him directly. I'm sentencing you to 40 years in federal prison. You will also surrender assets to the Victim Compensation Fund and will be required to register as a violent offender upon release. Damian stood up, his face red. This is insane. You can't... Sit down, Mr. Crow, Martinez said coldly, or I'll add contempt to your charges. Marcus Webb pulled him back into his chair, whispering urgently. Martinez wasn't finished. Additionally, I'm imposing permanent restraining orders preventing both defendants from contacting any of the victims in this case. Violation of these orders will result in additional federal charges. She closed the file. The damage you've caused is incalculable. The lives you've destroyed cannot be restored with a prison sentence. But this court can ensure you never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else. And that's exactly what I'm doing. She banged the gavel. This court is adjourned. The room erupted, crying, cheering, Damien shouting something about appeals while bailiffs moved to escort him out. His father sat silent, staring at nothing, finally understanding that his power was gone and wasn't coming back. Alara watched them being led away in handcuffs and felt something unlock in her chest. It was done. Actually done. 55 years meant Judge Crow would die in prison. 40 years meant Damien would be 72 before he saw freedom again. And she would be free. Outside the courthouse, the press was waiting with cameras and questions and the kind of hunger for stories that made Alara's skin crawl. But Sarah had prepared them for this. She gave a statement about justice being served while the victims stood behind her in a show of solidarity that looked good for the cameras and actually meant something to the women participating. When it was over, Rachel grabbed Alara's hand. Dinner tonight? All of us? A real celebration this time? Alara nodded. Yeah, I'd like that. They scattered to hotels and rental cars and the business of existing in a world where the trial was finally over. Alara walked to where Lucien was waiting by his car, leaning against the door with his arms crossed, and an expression that might have been satisfaction. How do you feel? He asked. Like I can breathe for the first time in years. She stopped in front of him. Thank you. For everything. For believing me when I didn't believe myself. For building a case that actually worked. For not letting me disappear. You did the hard part. I just gave you the tools. You gave me my life back. Lucien's expression softened slightly. You gave yourself your life back. I just cleared the obstacles. They stood there for a moment in the cold December air while the world moved around them. What happens now? Alara asked. Now you figure out what you want your life to look like. The safe house is yours for another month if you need it. After that, you're free to go wherever you want. Be whoever you want. He paused. No more hiding, no more running, just living. The concept felt foreign. She'd spent so long in survival mode that the idea of actually living, of making choices based on what she wanted, instead of what would keep her safe, was almost overwhelming. I don't know how to do that, she admitted. Nobody does at first, but you'll figure it out. He pushed off the car. Come on, I'll drive you back. You've got a celebration dinner to get ready for. The dinner was at a small Italian restaurant that Rachel had found, tucked away in a neighborhood where tourists didn't go, and locals knew better than to ask too many questions. 23 women crammed around tables pushed together, drinking wine and eating pasta and talking about everything except the trial. They talked about jobs and families and places they wanted to travel, about hobbies they'd given up and wanted to reclaim, about the small joys that had kept them going through the worst moments, about the future in a way that suggested they finally believed they had one. Alara sat between Rachel and Monica, listening to stories and laughing at jokes and feeling something that might have been belonging. These women understood things about her that she'd never have to explain. They'd lived in the same nightmare and survived it, and come out the other side changed but not broken. What are you going to do now? Monica asked during a lull in conversation. Now that it's over? Alara had been thinking about that question for weeks. I don't know yet. I need to find a real apartment, a real job, figure out who I am when I'm not running or testifying or preparing for the next disaster. That's the hard part, Rachel said quietly, figuring out how to be normal again. I don't think we get to be normal, Monica said. Not after this, but we get to be something better. We get to be survivors who chose to fight back. Someone raised a glass. To fighting back. To fighting back, they echoed, and the sound of glasses clinking filled the small restaurant. Later, after too much wine and too much food and too many stories that ended in both laughter and tears, Alara walked outside to get some air. The temperature had dropped and the threatened snow was finally starting to fall, small flakes that melted on contact but promised more to come. Lucien was out there, leaning against the building with a cigarette he wasn't smoking, just holding. I didn't know you smoked, Alara said. I don't. Quit 5 years ago. But I still carry them sometimes. Reminds me I can choose not to. He looked at the cigarette, then crushed it under his boot. How's the celebration? Good. Weird. Emotional. She leaned against the wall beside him. Those women in there, they're incredible. And they all think I'm some kind of hero when really, I just got lucky that you noticed I was in trouble. Luck had nothing to do with it. You survived. That's not luck. That's strength. He turned to face her. And you didn't just survive for yourself. You stood up in court and made sure everyone knew what happened. That's heroic whether you want to accept it or not. I still don't feel like a hero. Heroes rarely do. He straightened. I need to head out. Got a meeting in Atlanta tomorrow about another case. Something tightened in Alara's chest. Another case? Yeah, a woman who's being stalked by her ex. He's got connections. Thinks he's untouchable. Lucian's expression went hard. I'm going to prove him wrong. So you just move on to the next one? No break? No time to process? Processing is what therapy is for. I've got work to do. But his voice was gentler when he added, You'll be fine. Sarah's team will handle the asset forfeiture and victim compensation. Morrison will check in periodically. And you've got a whole network of women who understand what you went through. You're not alone anymore. Alara knew he was right, but the idea of him leaving, of the person who'd been her constant presence for months just disappearing into the next case, felt wrong somehow. Will I see you again? She asked. Lucian smiled slightly. Probably. Charleston's not that big, and I have a feeling you're going to do something that makes the news eventually. What makes you think that? Because you're not the type to just fade into the background. Not anymore. He pulled out his car keys. Take care of yourself, Alara Vance. You've earned it. He walked away before she could respond, disappearing into the snow that was starting to fall harder now. Alara stood there for a moment, feeling the cold bite at her skin, watching the street where his car had been. Then she went back inside to the warmth and the noise and the women who'd become her unexpected family. The next month passed in a blur of logistics, finding an apartment, a real one, not a safe house, with her name on the lease and no federal agents checking in, getting a job at a nonprofit that helped domestic violence survivors navigate the legal system, slowly rebuilding a life that felt like it belonged to her instead of being something she was hiding in. She had coffee with Rachel twice a week, joined a support group that Dr. Reeves recommended, started running in the mornings because it turned out that controlling her own body, pushing it to do hard things by choice, felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen. The nightmares didn't stop completely, but they got less frequent, less vivid. She learned to wake up without panic, to remind herself that she was safe, that the monsters were in prison and couldn't reach her anymore. 3 months after the sentencing, Sarah called with news about the Victim Compensation Fund. The asset forfeiture went through. Between the judge's investments and Damien's trust fund, we're looking at approximately $47 million available for distribution among the victims. Alara nearly dropped her phone. Million? Million. Split among 43 women. That's just over $1 million each. After taxes and legal fees, you're still looking at around $700,000. Sarah's voice was matter of fact. The paperwork should be finalized in the next 60 days. $700,000. Enough to never work again if she didn't want to. Enough to disappear to some quiet place and just exist. Enough to erase every financial struggle she'd ever had. But Alara had learned that money didn't fix trauma. It just gave you options. She thought about those options for weeks. Talked to Dr. Reeves about guilt, about whether accepting money from her abuser's assets made her complicit somehow. Talked to Rachel and Monica about what they were planning to do with their shares. Rachel was going back to school. Monica was starting a foundation for women escaping abuse. Others were buying houses, investing, saving for futures they'd thought they'd never have. And Alara kept coming back to one thought. She called Sarah 6 weeks later. I want to use my share to start something. A residential facility for women leaving abusive relationships. Somewhere they can stay while they figure out their next steps. Job training, legal support, therapy. Everything I wish I'd had when I left. Sarah was quiet for a moment. That's ambitious. I know, but I've been working with survivors for 3 months now, and the biggest problem is always the same. they have nowhere safe to go. Shelters are overcrowded. Programs have waiting lists. Women end up going back to their abusers because they literally have no other options. Alara's voice was steady. I want to create another option. You'll need a team: lawyers, social workers, security professionals. I know. I've been researching, making contacts. There's a building for sale downtown that used to be a hotel. 20 rooms, commercial kitchen, common areas. It's perfect. This is going to consume your life. Good. I need something to consume my life that isn't fear. Sarah made a sound that might have been approval. Send me a proposal. I know some people who might want to invest, and I'll put you in touch with nonprofits that do similar work. You can learn from what they've built. Alara spent the next 4 months building something real. She bought the building using her compensation money, hired contractors to renovate it into a space that felt safe instead of institutional, brought on a social worker, a trauma therapist, a legal advocate, created programs for job training and financial literacy and all the practical skills that made the difference between surviving and actually living. She named it Emma's house. When Lucian found out, and of course he found out the man had sources everywhere, he showed up at the construction site unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. Emma's house, he said, looking at the sign being installed over the entrance. I hope that's okay. I wanted to honor her, to make sure her story mattered for something. Lucian stared at the sign for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. She would have loved this, would have been the first person through the door offering to help. I know, that's why it's named after her. Alara walked him through the building, showing him the rooms being renovated, the common spaces being created, the security systems being installed. We're opening in 6 weeks, 20 beds, priority for women with children. No maximum stay as long as they're actively working toward independence. You're going to change lives here. I'm going to try. That's all I can promise. She stopped in what would eventually be the main common room. I wanted to ask you something. What? Would you consult on security? Make sure this place is actually safe? That women who come here don't have to worry about their abusers finding them? Lucian looked around the space, calculating sight lines and entry points, and all the things that made a place defensible. Yeah, I can do that. I can pay you. Don't insult me. He turned back to her. This is important work. I'll make sure it's protected. Emma's house opened on a rainy Saturday in August, with less fanfare than Alara had expected. No press, no grand ceremony, just the quiet arrival of the first resident, a woman named Carmen with a black eye, and 2 kids who looked at everything like it might disappear if they blinked. You're safe here, Alara told her, helping carry boxes to her room. No one's going to hurt you, and you can stay as long as you need to figure out what comes next. Carmen started crying, not sad tears, relief tears, the kind that came when someone who'd been holding their breath for too long finally got to exhale. Over the next months, more women arrived, each with their own story, each carrying trauma like luggage they couldn't put down. And slowly, with support and time and the space to heal, they started rebuilding. Alara watched them and saw herself, saw Rachel and Monica and all 43 women who'd testified, saw Emma, who'd never gotten this chance. And she understood finally what Lucian had meant about processing. This was how you processed, by taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and transforming it into something that helped others, by refusing to let the pain be meaningless, by building something good from the wreckage. A year after the sentencing, Alara received a letter. It came through the facility's P.O. box, addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a single page. Dear Ms. Vance, my name is Jennifer Walsh. You don't know me, but I know your story. I was one of the women in Judge Crow's trafficking network. I was too scared to testify during the trial, too broken to believe that coming forward would matter. But I've been following what you did after. Emma's house, the work you're doing, the lives you're changing. I'm writing to say thank you, and to ask if maybe there's room for one more woman who's trying to find her way back to herself. Jennifer Alara called the number included at the bottom of the letter. Jennifer? This is Alara Vance. We have a room available. When can you get here? The woman on the other end of the line started crying. Today, tomorrow, I can be there whenever. Take your time. Pack what you need. The room will be here when you arrive. Alara paused. And Jennifer? You're going to be okay. I promise. After they hung up, Ilara sat in her office and thought about promises. About how, a year ago, she couldn't have promised anything to anyone. How she'd been so broken she could barely promise herself that tomorrow would come. But she'd survived. And then she'd done more than survive. She'd built something that mattered. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lucien. Lucien. Heard you're at capacity. Need me to help find funding for expansion? She smiled. Already working on it. But thanks for the offer. That's my girl. Ilara stared at those 3 words, casual, probably meaningless, and felt something warm settle in her chest. She wasn't his girl. Wasn't anyone's anything except her own. But she understood what he meant. She'd become someone who didn't need saving anymore. Someone who saved others. Someone who'd taken every awful thing that happened to her and turned it into fuel for making sure it didn't happen to anyone else. That evening, she gathered the current residents in the common room for their weekly meeting. 7 women ranging from early 20s to late 50s, all at different stages of healing. I got a letter today, Ilara said, from a woman who wants to come here, who's ready to start rebuilding. Is there room? Carmen asked. She'd been there the longest, had already started job training, and was planning to move into her own apartment in 2 months. We'll make room. We always make room. Ilara looked around at these women who'd become more than residents, who'd become a community. I wanted to ask you all something. This place is growing faster than I expected. I'm looking at expanding, buying the building next door, doubling our capacity. But I don't want to make that decision alone. This is your home too. What do you think? The discussion lasted an hour. Concerns about maintaining the intimate feeling of the house, excitement about helping more women, questions about funding and staffing and logistics. But by the end, they'd reached consensus. Expand, grow, help more people, make Emma's house into something bigger than any of them had imagined. Ilara spent the next 6 months working toward that goal. Lucien helped with security planning for the expansion. Sarah connected her with donors and foundations. Rachel joined the board of directors. Monica became the lead counselor. The network of women who'd testified against the Crows became the foundation of something larger, a movement built on the belief that surviving wasn't enough. You had to transform survival into purpose. On the 1-year anniversary of the sentencing, Ilara stood in the expanded Emma's house, now 40 beds, fully staffed, with a waiting list of women who needed help, and allowed herself to feel proud. She'd started at an altar, forced into a marriage she didn't want by men who thought they owned her. She'd ended here, creating sanctuary for women who needed to remember they owned themselves. The journey between those 2 points had been brutal, exhausting, painful in ways she was still processing, but it had been worth it. Her phone rang. Lucien. You coming to the anniversary thing tomorrow? She asked. There was a celebration planned, a fundraiser, really, marking 1 year since the verdict. Most of the women who'd testified were coming. Press coverage was expected. It was a big deal. Can't. I'm in Seattle on a case, but I'll be thinking about you. He paused. I'm proud of you. Emma would be proud too. Thank you for everything. I know I keep saying that, but stop thanking me and keep doing the work. That's all the thanks I need. His voice softened. You turned your nightmare into something beautiful. That's rare. Don't ever forget how rare that is. After they hung up, Ilara stood at the window overlooking the street where women came and went with the freedom to choose their own paths, where safety wasn't a luxury, where healing was possible. She thought about Damien, sitting in a cell for the next 39 years, about Judge Crow, who would die in prison, about all the power they'd wielded and how ultimately it meant nothing because it was built on cruelty instead of care. And she thought about the alternative timeline, the one where Lucien hadn't walked through those cathedral doors, where she'd married Damien and spent her life being slowly destroyed, where 43 other women never got justice, where Emma's house never existed. That timeline was close enough to touch, a few different choices, a few different circumstances. She'd gotten lucky, but she'd also fought, testified, survived, built, and now she got to watch other women do the same. The anniversary celebration happened without her. Ilara stayed at Emma's house instead, helping Jennifer move into her room, listening to Carmen talk about her new job, watching women who'd arrived broken start to become whole. This was where she belonged. Not at fundraisers or press events, or places where people wanted to treat her like a symbol instead of a person. She belonged here, doing the quiet work of helping women remember they were more than what had been done to them. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Alara sat in her office and pulled out the wedding dress scraps she'd saved. The pieces she'd cut away that first night in the safe house. She'd kept them in a box, not sure why, not ready to throw them away. Now she knew why. She took the scraps and a pair of scissors and started cutting them smaller. Turned the expensive silk and lace into confetti. When she was done, she put the pieces in an envelope and addressed it to the federal prison where Damien was serving his sentence. Inside the envelope, she included a note. I was supposed to wear this while marrying you. Instead, I wore it while becoming free. These scraps are all that's left of the life you tried to force me into. Thought you should know what became of it. I'm building something better now, something you'll never touch, something that exists specifically to undo the damage men like you cause. You have 39 years to think about that. Alara. She mailed it the next morning and felt the last piece of him fall away. Months passed. Seasons changed. Emma's house grew from 40 beds to 60. The wait list got longer. More women came through the doors carrying trauma and left carrying hope. And Alara learned that healing wasn't a destination, it was a practice. Something you did every day. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but always forward. 2 years after the sentencing, she received another letter, this one from Damien. She almost threw it away, unread. But curiosity won. Alara, I've had a lot of time to think in here, about what I did, about who I was, about the man I became because I never learned that people weren't things I could own. This isn't an apology. Words don't fix what I broke. But I wanted you to know that I see it now, the damage, the pattern, the way I turned into my father without even realizing it. I hope you're happy. I hope you've built a life that doesn't include the weight of what I did to you. I'll spend the next 37 years in here. And honestly, I deserve every day of it. Damien Alara read it twice. Then she put it in a drawer and forgot about it. His redemption wasn't her responsibility. His growth wasn't her concern. He could spend the rest of his life becoming a better person, and it wouldn't change what he'd done or undo the scars he'd left. She had more important things to focus on, like the woman who just arrived at Emma's house with a baby and a black eye, and the kind of terror Alara recognized intimately, like the fundraiser that would let them expand again. Like the speaking engagement she'd agreed to do at a domestic violence conference where she'd tell her story one more time in the hope that it helped someone else find the courage to leave. Like the life she'd built from nothing and was still building every single day. 3 years after the sentencing, Alara sat in Dr. Reeves' office for what she knew would be one of their last sessions. I think I'm done, she said. Dr. Reeves looked up from her notes. Done with therapy? Done needing it the way I used to. I still have bad days, probably always will. But I'm not drowning anymore, I'm just swimming. Alara smiled. And I think I can swim without weekly check-ins now. How does it feel, saying that out loud? Scary. Good. Like graduating from something I never wanted to enroll in. She paused. Thank you for helping me get here. You did the work. I just held the flashlight while you found your way through the dark. Doctor. Reeves closed her notebook. You know where to find me if you need me. But I think you're right. You're ready to swim on your own. They shook hands and Alara walked out of the office feeling lighter. That evening, she stood on the front steps of Emma's house and watched the sun set over Charleston. The building was full. 60 women and their children, all working toward futures they'd chosen instead of ones that had been forced on them. Somewhere in the city, Lucien was probably working on another case, helping another victim, building another investigation that would bring down another monster. Somewhere, Rachel was finishing her degree. Monica was running her foundation. 43 women were living lives they'd fought for and earned. And Alara was here, running a place that had helped hundreds of women over the past 3 years. Creating sanctuary, building hope, transforming trauma into purpose. She thought about this woman she'd been 3 years ago, standing at that altar in a dress that cost more than dignity, marrying a man who'd broken her bones and her spirit, believing she had no choice. That woman felt like a stranger now, not because the trauma had disappeared, but because Alara had grown around it, built a life so full of meaning that the pain became just one part of her story instead of the whole thing. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize. This is Carmen. I'm in my new apartment. First night on my own in 3 years. I'm terrified and excited, and I wanted to say thank you. for giving me a place to remember who I was before he broke me. I found her again. She's different now, stronger, but she's still me. Alara smiled and typed back, "You found yourself. I just gave you a safe place to look. I'm proud of you." The sun finished setting and the streetlights came on. Inside Emma's house, someone was laughing. Someone else was cooking dinner. Children were playing. Women were existing in the simple, profound act of living without fear. Alara walked inside and closed the door behind her. She didn't think about Damien anymore. Didn't wonder if he'd really changed or if his letter had been genuine. It didn't matter. She thought about the next woman who would walk through these doors needing help. About the expansion plans that would add another wing. About the speaking tour she'd agreed to do next month. About all the ways she could turn her survival into someone else's salvation. This was her life now, not perfect, not without scars, but hers. Completely and utterly hers. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.